For our next conversation, I'd like to invite to the stage a man who rose to the top of British politics and then went to Silicon Valley, to the heart of Silicon Valley. Please welcome Sir Nick Clegg, former UK Deputy Prime Minister and until January, Meta's President of Global Affairs. Sir Nick, nice to have you back on home turf.
It's nice to be here.
I feel like you've been unleashed now. You're done with politics. You've left Silicon Valley, so you can tell us the truth.
So I can be unbridled.
Exactly.
Right.
Let's start by asking you, why did you really leave Meta?
Oh, that's a nice way to start. Look, I've been there for almost 7 years. I was never going to stay there forever. And these big companies, you know, they go through these great sort of chapters, and there's a sort of ebb and flow to their development. And when I arrived in Silicon Valley in late 2018, I mean, it was just a completely different world. Remember that, you know, particularly that company, the explosive growth over the previous decade or so, the world's largest social media platform, nothing like it had ever existed before, and it got snarled up with a whole bunch of very, very sort of all-consuming societal controversies: Cambridge Analytica, Russian interference in the 2016 election. And you had this, you know, almost quite violent mood swing from sort of techno-euphoria, where these new technologies were going to solve all the world's problems, through to sort of techno-pessimism that, you know, these technologies were the source of all the world's problems. And in a sense, I sort of arrived at a time when sort of Mark Zuckerberg and at the time then Sheryl Sandberg wanted to find a way to kind of navigate some of that. It's a technology company. It's run by engineers. This was quite new to them. So having a sort of, you know, gnarled old politician spat out from the world of Westminster politics made some sense. And so over the following half decade or so, myself and other people, you know, I didn't do it on my own. We just pursued a number of strategies to sort of steady the ship, if I can put it like that, to kind of get the company off the front pages, out of trouble, changed a whole bunch of things, made the workings of the company more transparent, created an oversight board, gave users more control over what they can see when using the apps, opened it up to researchers, re-established or rebuilt relationships with governments and regulators. That phase is clearly now, you know, giving way to a new chapter as not just Meta, but Silicon Valley as a whole. You know, you saw those famous pictures at the time of the inauguration of Donald Trump.
The Mount Rushmore of tech.
Well, sort of leaning into, how can I put it, are leaning into politics, or at least US politics, whereas I guess it's probably fair to say that the period of time during which I had some sort of say over these things, it was really about trying to sort of keep out of politics. So it felt like a very natural juncture, and you know, clearly the company, certainly in this sort of domain that I was responsible for, is now pursuing, you know, is evolving in a different direction. It's not, how can I put it? It doesn't appeal to my skill set, I guess.
Yeah, but is it fair to take away that you were uncomfortable with Mark Zuckerberg leaning into his MAGA bro era?
It's not that. It's kind of no. It's much more practical than that. I'm not American. I joined in part because the conversations I had with Mark Zuckerberg in the summer, autumn of 2018 demonstrated to me that he had an acute awareness that the company might have been an American company, but certainly in terms of the users of Facebook, I think it's still true to say that over 90% of the users of Facebook are outside the United States. That has all shifted now for all sorts of wider reasons, which we can go into. So it's normal, and it felt very natural that the person who's now doing the job I used to do is an American.
And a Republican.
And a former Republican, and he was my deputy, and he's an extremely accomplished guy for many years. So no, it felt like a very natural turning of the page.
But what do you make of Mark Zuckerberg endorsing Trump? He gave that $1 million inauguration gift. Do you think that he's actually getting anything out of this relationship with the president?
Honestly, you need to ask. I mean, you need to ask all the great captains of industry whether they, you know, and only time will tell how they feel about this pivot. Look, the background to it is interesting. It's partly domestic politics. I think Silicon Valley had traditionally been a firmly centre-left sort of coastal elite type place. Lots of sort of, you know, earnest New York Times reading millennials in T-shirts, building great things kind of thing. But I think the Democrats particularly under the sort of almost vituperatively, reflexively anti-tech ideology of Elizabeth Warren and others, of course, that had an alienating effect. I mean, these people are human. They're like anybody else. They want to be able to, they don't expect to be universally loved, but they want to be able to kind of be a little bit appreciated for some of the stuff they did. So I think there was a push, you pull me there. Okay. And, you know, obviously my politics couldn't be more starkly different to the current US administration. But I think the Democrats, if they're thoughtful, should ask themselves quite profound questions why a place that was basically a kind of bit of a Democrat, theirs, they actually had all the leaders of that place literally, physically and metaphorically lined up behind their political opponent. And I think the Democrats need to ask themselves quite searching questions about how they can try and sort of shun Silicon Valley for good if they want, but I think that's not smart politics for a centre-left party. So there's that. And then there's the whole US-China rivalry, which I think is part of the reason why there is this sort of glue that's fusing Silicon Valley and DC together. I think there's a very strong sense in the United States that, you know, this is an existential battle for technological supremacy, and I think people feel that very strongly in Silicon Valley as they do in DC. And then I think there were events. I think the pandemic and all the kind of roiling debates there about whether that led to over-censorship or excessive content moderation, the George Floyd protest, the 2020 election itself taking place during a pandemic, the perception certainly amongst people on the right, conservatives in the US, that platforms like Meta and others kind of were leaning too heavily in trying to moderate content. There was this whole thing about Hunter Biden laptop. All of this congealed, and we can have a debate about what's right and what's wrong, but it congealed into a perception that led to this kind of quite extreme sort of course correction now. It happens in politics, pendulums swing. Generally, you find over history, it's the course correction creates as many problems as the thing that it's reacting to, and I suspect that will happen. It is happening now as well. But anyway, all of that is the backcloth to it. But the interesting thing historically is, firstly, that of course Silicon Valley and DC were traditionally almost pulling in opposite directions. Yeah. I mean, if you spend any time there, they're on the other side of this great continental landmass. Silicon Valley's almost prided itself on sort of having nothing to do with politics and thinking bigger thoughts elsewhere. I happen to think, and it's always very interesting because I was often the only ex-politician in the room, I was always of the view, I'm still of the view, that on the whole, innovation takes place better when at arm's length from politics. And I certainly think when it comes to speech, if you are a major platform of speech, I generally think keeping a distance from politics is smart business. Now that's given way, as I say, to a different thing, but I suspect these things will go in cycles, and I strongly suspect the lesson will be relearned that engineering excellence and politics just doesn't mix great, and a little. I'll tell you what. There's only one thing that's probably worse in a developed capitalist economy. There's only one thing that's worse than having powerful businesses and politicians at each other's throats. It's having them in each other's sort of pockets. You want something. Well, you want something in between, and I think that's probably where it's all going to net out in the end.
Speaking of that, what do you make of Elon Musk and Donald Trump's relationship? Because he did the opposite thing to you, right? He's gone from big tech to government and now out. Was it a mistake to join Donald Trump?
Oh, I have no expertise in understanding the extraordinary mind of Elon Musk. I think it's not wholly surprising that two such combustible characters should fall out with each other. I think the only thing I would say is, slightly as per my earlier comment, I think if you care in the long run about the quality of our democracy, it's a rather odd thing perhaps for me to say, because I'm not really self-evidently not really aligned with the kind of, in my own personal politics, the politics of the current US administration. I actually think it's, oddly enough, really important that Donald Trump is seen to win against Elon Musk, that he holds the whip hand, because in the end it's essential for any democracy that the people who are elected hold the whip hand and not the people who just happen to have got vast pots of money to be able to throw at their their political adventures. And I think in a very, very kind of melodramatic and kind of crude way, that's kind of what you're seeing once again, which is in the end, and I've always felt this, in the end, politics will generally triumph. And I think that's kind of what's playing out. And of course, the melodrama and who says what about whom and the tweets and the counter tweets.
Do you think it's real?
What do I think? What do you mean?
The feud, or is it just theatrics?
I have no idea. It seems to me pretty real. I don't think you say things like that about the President of the United States if you're not pretty hot under the collar about stuff. So I just think in the sort of this kind of ebb and flow of private sector power and political power, we've seen a very, very important set of sort of gyrations in recent months in the United States. As I say, the sort of almost fusion of political and sort of tech leadership power, which is new in the United States. That's now, of course, leading to some cracks. The Musk-Trump thing. My view in the long run is it should, and I suspect it will, settle down to something where there should be a mature relationship, but there should be wariness. They represent different interests. Those businesses are not. They're running businesses. They're not philosopher kings. They might think that some of them might think they are. They're not. They run businesses, and they're competing ferociously with each other, and they're brilliant at it. But they're not there to make societal trade-offs. That's what the governments who we elect for better or for worse, are there for.
So speaking of business, if we look at Silicon Valley and we're thinking about the lessons that we should be learning in Europe, we're going to have Peter Kyle on later, the tech secretary. Is it regulation that's holding us back here from building the next Meta, or what should Peter Kyle be doing to help European tech?
Well, I think Peter and his colleagues are doing good things, and I think I certainly they've turned a page on some of what I felt was. I think the previous government got a little bit hijacked by the kind of moral panic around, gosh, is AI going to extinguish humanity by next Tuesday? Are the robots with glaring red eyes going to march down my high street kind of thing? And so we spent a huge amount of political capital was invested really at swinging at apocalyptic windmills, and I think this government's at least moved beyond that. And I think some of the things that Matt Clifford and Peter Kyle and others have been saying make a bunch of sense. Look, there are lots of diagnoses of why it is that you have this extraordinary scaled technological excellence emanating from the United States and China and not from Europe. And a lot of people kind of go on about regulation. And sure, some regulation is dumb. I think the EU AI Act is just crackers that they've passed legislation to legislate a technology which I know, because I spoke to many of the people who crafted the legislation, they literally didn't understand the technology. It was really quite nascent at the time. They should have just pushed the pause button and waited. So they were trying to sort of regulate something, on the hoof, and that never works out very well. I think some of the online harms and Digital Service Act stuff could prove to be a bit too heavy-handed and so on. But I don't personally think, if you step back, that's actually the major problem. I think our major problem is just a lack of scale. It's just a lack of scale. We don't have the scale. We don't have the big liquid capital markets as you do in the US, or indeed in a different way in China. You don't have the scaled domestic market. If you're in the US or China, you come up with a new product, you can ship it across a vast seamless market instantly. We've, in my view, in an act of spectacular self-harm, have cut off ourselves from our own economic market on our own hinterland in Europe, and in the European Union, the digital single market is still lamentably fragmented. If anything, there's been too much fragmented regulation, and not enough sort of regulation to actually just do what the single market promised to do, which is create the same market scale. We don't have the same infrastructure. We don't have the sort of scaled infrastructure as they do in the US and China. So I think certainly for a technology which at this stage relies so heavily on big things, I mean, the physics of this is incredibly expensive. You need a huge amount of money, huge amount of data, huge amount of energy, water, infrastructure. I saw Keir Starmer, brandish his announcement a couple of days ago on the stage with Jensen that the government was going to announce an extra £1 billion for some compute capacity. I mean, I think, is it right that Microsoft is spending
80 billion?
80 billion just this year alone? I suspect, Alex Schultz can tell me, I think Meta, maybe 70 billion, maybe Google, they've got their TPUs, maybe it's more, maybe it's 90, 100.
So what you're saying is it's chicken feed?
It's just Lilliputian compared to what this technology currently requires, which is scale. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean we can't do really innovative things. And I actually think the UK is in a good place to do that, not least because of the innovative genius of many people at places like this in deploying AI in the workplace, in schools, in hospitals, in societally. I think there's no iron rule that says because you've invented the sort of base layer of this technology, you're also going to excel at deploying it. Anyone who's used the high street banking system in the US will know, the consumer experience there is like the 1970s compared to anyone in Europe. So a lot of these technologies and industries doesn't necessarily follow that. So I do think deploying AI is where our strength could lie. But I just think, in answer to your question, people always bang on about regulation. Sure, I actually think it's just lack of scale. And look, I saw this myself in the sort of relatively short period of time I was in Silicon Valley, 6-7 years there. I was a senior person at Meta, and I was surrounded by European colleagues. Alex Schultz, the CMO of Meta, the COO of Meta is European, the head of cyber is Israeli-British, the head of Facebook was a French lady who's now basically working as number 10. What is it that we have all these great Europeans running these wonderful American companies? Why on earth can't we do it here ourselves? And I think in the long run it is because of a lack of scale. We've lost the ability in our continent to act as the sum of our parts. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, I passionately believe, I've believed it all my life and believe it even more so now, our higgledy-piggledy continent with all these middle, small countries in this insecure part of the world, Russia here, Middle East there, Africa there, we're not like the US, we're not a vast, homogenous continent. What?
Should Keir Starmer lean into the EU more
yes,
then?
Of course.
Stop pretending softly, you could have both the US and China and the EU.
But of course. I mean, I know it's difficult to it's difficult to envisage that because of the scar tissue that still remains around the Brexit wars, and no one wants to I don't want to have another argument about it. But I'm afraid geography doesn't change. We're on this side of the ocean. We're not on that side of the ocean. We are tectonically condemned to be a European country, and geography still determines trade more than almost any other factor. Yeah. Not just trade in goods, but also services, geographical proximity. And remains just a fact of life that it doesn't matter what your ideology is, it doesn't matter, And I think if you look at trading patterns, there's a reason why the US will always trade more with Canada and Mexico than we ever will. There's a reason we will always trade more with Ireland, Belgium and Italy than we do with the US, because we're close by. And I think in a world where these blocks, particularly as China and the US, measure up against each other, I think, I'm afraid we're going to have to once again reopen the age-old debate. Where does our strategic interests lie? And they lie in our hemisphere, not several thousand miles away, in the end.
I want to talk to you about something I know you're very excited about, and that's agentic AI. I feel like that's the difference between this year's Founders Forum and last, that's really what we're going to be focusing on. Do you think that governments have really processed the power agentic AI is going to put in the hands of tech companies compared to good old-fashioned social media?
Well, I mean, others will have more expert views than me. I think in a weird kind of way, this sprint towards agentic AI, which all the big players are clearly pushing towards, will almost be like a version of this very interesting sort of power paradox that you saw in the age of social media. And what I mean by that is social media empowers us as individuals to the most extraordinary degree. We can use this stuff for free, we can say what we like, we can communicate with people, we can do all sorts of things at the fingertips. We've got access to more information than any previous generation could imagine. And yet at the same time, the underlying technology is highly concentrated, highly aggregated in the hands of very, very small number of very kind of powerful folk in Silicon Valley. And in a sense, agentic AI is, I think, going to be like that. It's going to have that characteristic but even more so because I think the sense of personalization, the sense of intimacy that people will have with their AI companion. I don't think we found. I mean, I saw Mark Zuckerberg talk about this the other day, and I think he got a bit criticized, but I actually thought he was trying to say, which seems right to me, that we haven't found the right language yet. People talk about friends, but of course that makes everyone a bit spooky because you say, well, it's not a friend, it's a thing. It's not a friend. It's not, friendships is all about the endless compromise you have with your friends. We all get more infuriated by our friends than anyone. You're constantly kind of adapting yourself to the needs of someone else. This is something which is just simply
one way.
Exactly. It's a one-way thing. It's sort of friendship as service, which is not friendship. Friendship is a much more complex, rich kind of process of compromise and loyalty and so on and so forth. So I think friendship doesn't quite work. Companionship is probably a little bit closer to what it might offer. It offers great utility, but much more than that. People will fall in love with their with AI entities, yes, and people will go to, as they already do, to agentic AI, to AI agents for mental health support and so on and so forth. So you'll have this extraordinary intimacy, particularly as the memory of these agentic AIs, as the memory of what you have said to them and shared with them builds up. Yet at the same time, as I explained earlier, that the underlying technology is highly centralized. It's a highly centralized, the sort of physics of it is very centralizing. And I think that raises a bunch of dilemmas about, power and responsibility. And for instance, in the US, what those agents say, what those AI entities say to you will not be protected by Section 230. So the companies won't be able to say, oh, nothing to do with us. This is just humans talking to each other across our pipe work. It's actually the company. So that hasn't been properly explored. I think you do have profound ethical issues about people who are feeling very lonely, very vulnerable. The dependency that clearly will raise real issues. Who's responsible for that and so on? I think we're really at the foothills of that debate at the moment.
Because there have been thousands of lawsuits filed against Meta, TikTok, Snap, alleging harm to children. If agentic AI is going to be like social media on steroids, how can the industry be confident that the damage to society won't be on a far larger scale than social media?
Well, I slightly question the premise that somehow social media sort of inflicted societal. I don't. That's a separate debate. I think there are plenty of things that I would absolutely acknowledge were not properly anticipated and maybe could have been navigated more better and so on. But I think, as on the whole, I remain firmly of the view that a technology which empowers people to express themselves, to communicate with each other, particularly to share experiences with people of sort of similar, interests and so on, friends and family, is a very powerful and a great agent for economic growth as well, because it allows small and medium-sized businesses to reach customers in a way that only big companies with big marketing budgets could in the past. I'm not sure if I accept the premise, but I think there are certain ingredients which endure throughout all of this. High levels of transparency, high levels of user control, so you have agency as the human being over the experience. You can wipe the memory. I just think transparency and control, they're not all of the answer, but honestly, I think they are a very, very considerable step to creating the right balance. Because if you don't have that control over the agentic AI experience, the transparency of how it is responding to you, if you don't lift the veil on that, then you get this dynamic that you saw during social media where people didn't quite understand why they saw what on their feed. It was a sort of mysterious thing. Why am I seeing this now? Why am I seeing that ad? And because they don't understand the technology behind the veil, they of course think the worst of it. And then you've got this whole kind of this whole surveillance capitalism, sort of intellectual cottage industry, making candidly ludicrous assertions about the power of the algorithms to burrow into our neural pathways and make us think and do things we otherwise wouldn't, most of which has actually been proved to be nonsense. But so I think the companies have an overwhelming interest to go further in being more transparent and giving users more control than candidly they're likely to left to their own devices. And that is where if I was a regulator or government, I'd be pushing them really hard now for their own good. Otherwise, you're going to get this great big pendulum cycle. Again, you're going to get a societal backlash, and it's just going to be rinse and repeat. And we should avoid that. Of course we should.
Just finally, Sir Nick, I have to ask you, as someone who was a student in the 2010s, looking back on your career in politics and in Silicon Valley, what's been the biggest lesson? What's been the biggest regret?
Biggest lesson, golly. Biggest lesson. I don't think I've got any great penetration. I mean, as a general, I'm 58 now. I've been very lucky to do some very interesting things in my career. I generally think I think what I learned in Silicon Valley, which I admired enormously, was just the sheer chutzpah of just going for stuff and making big swings at things. Whereas my old world of politics has become much more cramped, and people just don't make big swings. They know there are big things. Look at this whole debate we're having this week about the spending round. There's some huge issues in this country around productivity, lack of growth. We're basically reshaping the state to become a health and welfare state. We now spend, almost 4 or 5 times as much on welfare as we do on defence. By the end of the decade, our public spending, 50% of it will be on health. How are we going to do that? How are we going to do that with an aging population? So I think, oddly enough, I sort of relearned in Silicon Valley something which you kind of almost want to look for in politicians, which is the willingness to take big swings. Some of them may work, some of them may not. Biggest regret, honestly, I think the biggest regret I have, and I think anyone in politics of my generation should have, is none of us, and this is across parties, it really is, and I think anyone who's ever been in politics or in high office, I hope, would say this, is in this country, is we've just failed on housing. We've just really, really failed. I think
Not tuition fees, then? Not tuition fees?
No, listen, do you want me to really rant about that? No. Anyway, no, actually, but I now hear the university sector talk about that as the golden era when they had plenty of money to throw around. It actually exempted them from austerity, but there's a separate thing. Now, housing is absolutely crucial to economic growth, social mobility, and to generational justice, and the way that we've penalised young people by basically locking them out of the housing market altogether by a failure to build more. I think some of the announcements yesterday on social housing are fine, but they need to go way further. You need to free up the supply side much more radically than is the case. So when I look back on my political career, it's a thing which I think, why did I not spend more time about that? It's partly because it's not politically rewarding, because it takes so long and political cycles are short, but it's the thing that I feel has been a persistent political failure, a chronic political failure, and I certainly, I think, played my part in that as much as anyone else who's been in office over the last 20, 30 years.
I think the new Deputy Prime Minister agrees with you, Angela Rayner. So Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for making time for us.